Welcome back to One Piece Explained. The Elbaph arc is finally in high gear with these last two chapters as we find the Holy Knights leaping into action and squaring off against all of our heroes. There's a ton to talk about between the secrets of their immortality, Brook's potential connection to Gunko, Harald and Jarl's history with world government, and much more. So let's get right into it. Of course, we start things off with our 31st and 32nd entries in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surrogate Pilgrimage cover story as we continue to wrap up the aftermath of Yamato's attack on Who's Who and his little operation. As many of us suspected over the last several weeks, it seems Ulti feels indebted to Yamato for saving both her and her brother's life and wishes to become a follower of Yamato's. This is certainly positioning Yamato to follow in Oden's footsteps by gaining a crew of ragtag companions. Tama and Speed have just been traveling alongside Yamato for the last stretch of the cover story, but it's not totally clear if they will both join under Yamato's banner officially. There's also a nice thread here with Yamato, Ulti, and Page One all being raised under Kaido's care at some point in their lives, making them siblings in some form. Now in the latest chapter, we see our heroes leaving Who's Who's hideout, which is now properly damaged, as they encounter Raizo, who is now the daimyo of Udon, as we had speculated, given that he was originally from this region. He greets Yamato and Tama with a bag of food, which is a recurring bit in this cover story as Yamato has had 4 meals prior to this, but it also emphasizes the current prosperity of the various regions of Wano after Orochi's reign was ended. Food is abundant and can be shared between the citizens of the country without worry. Now the last interesting tidbit in this cover page is that it seems Who's Who has finally been unmasked, as you can see some of the samurai holding up his headpiece in anger in the background. I had been wondering if we'd get a glimpse of his face after Yamato's victory, and it looks like we are heading down this path, hopefully sooner than later. We've seen Who's Who without the mask before in the series and in the SBS where he was portrayed as a child, but his eyes have always been covered by his hair. I wonder if there'll be any significant trait being hidden, such as perhaps a third eye or something like that. So with that said, let's get into chapter 1147, What We're Afraid Of. So we pick back up where we left off in the last chapter with Summers having beaten Saul into submission with his Thorn Fruit abilities, though the chapter starts with a brief flashback to just before Saul's clash with Summers. It would appear that Saul also is familiar with the Holy Knights, having seen Summers in particular before, and in the previous chapter, it was rather intriguing how Brook may have come to learn of the existence of this class of world government soldier, but I suppose it's a little less unusual for a high-ranking Marine like Saul to have encountered the group at some time in the past. Saul also knows that the Holy Knights are immortal, meaning the regenerative abilities that we saw displayed by Gunko in the previous chapter likely extends to all in the group, and if this immortality was granted to the group as far back as 38 years ago, then someone like Garling would have it as well, though it is worthwhile to note that Garling has still aged over the last 4 or so decades, suggesting that the regeneration that we saw with Gunko and the Elders is not necessarily the same ability that has seemingly froze the Elders' ages all these years. This all does make me wonder just where exactly Saul would have been to not only see the Holy Knights, but also their immortality on display. While it is possible he may have just heard about it or been told about this branch of the world government, the Holy Knights seem to be a much more clandestine group as of this point, so perhaps Saul became aware of them during a situation where both the forces of the Marines and the Holy Knights were needed. And so far, the only event we are aware of where something like that went down would of course be the native hunting competition that took place on God Valley, or perhaps one of the other instances since it was said to occur every 3 years. In any case, it seems while Summers was dealing with Saul, Gunko had been busy detaining the Straw Hats after making light work of them in a previous chapter. And since I didn't get a chance to talk about 1146 last week, I should address a few interesting points from that clash. Nami debuted a new technique called the Thunder Shark Tempo, where Zeus takes the form of a shark-shaped cloud and is propelled at the enemy. This is the first time that we've seen Nami's techniques take a specific shape, and it being a shark this time is particularly interesting given her history with Arlong. Unfortunately, this move just gets redirected by Gunko's arrow abilities and strikes at Brook instead, recreating one of my favorite gags from Whole Cake Island and being another instance of Brook mistakenly taking an attack for Nami, only to be fined because of his lack of flesh. This unique property was first established back during Thriller Bark, when Brook worked together with the Straw Hats to take on Oars, as he requested to be charged with lightning and propelled toward the ancient giant. This was the debut of a move called the Gavotte Bond en Avant, which is normally just a thrusting technique with his cane sword, and the move that he was going to use against Gunko until it was redirected at Jinbei, who also unintentionally delivered a 5,000 brick fist to Brook. This scene is a bit reminiscent of a moment from Fishman Island, where Jinbei and Luffy both strike at each other and Sanji as Robin intercepts their fight. Gunko's ability here is named Aloe, a pun on the word's pronunciation in Japanese being similar to arrow, and the kanji for it reads Faded Arrow. We see her use an arrow to wrap around and pull up Colin from his neck, much like how we saw with Loki's befriended pet wolf, but the more intriguing ability on display was of course Gunko's regeneration. Up until this point, we were under the impression that this was a technique exclusive to the 5 Elders, but as we learn from Saul in this chapter, it extends to the Holy Knights as well. There's also a bit of a joke at play here when it was revealed, as we found out as a result of Usopp's Skull Blast Grass. You might recall that earlier in the arc, we saw this technique was not powerful enough to break through the reinforced walls of the Lego village that Roto had constructed, and many fans took this opportunity to make fun of Usopp's ineffectiveness. Here, the very same technique is depicted being so seemingly strong that it blew off half of Gunko's body, which of course is something that we've never really seen before, only to find out that was just a byproduct of Gunko's body being more susceptible than most because of her regenerative properties. We saw this throughout the climax of the Egghead arc, as Saturn and the other 5 elders were shown with rather weak constitutions to the point of having their limbs ripped off or holes being punched through their bodies. The mystery of this strange ability still continues, but I have a rather exciting idea about how this regeneration could work, and I'll be going into more of that in a future video that I've been working on. While there are a lot of theories out there, I've yet to see anyone talk about this idea in particular, and I'm really excited to share it with you all soon, so keep an eye out for that. But back to this chapter. Summers inquires if the Straw Hats are to be taken captive as well, to which Killingham chastises him for, reminding him that the purpose for them being here is solely for their mission, not to start trouble with an emperor. It's always so cool to see Luffy and the crew getting treated with this much respect and as a real global threat, and it's equally interesting to learn that the Holy Knights may also have similar constraints to the Marines and Cypherpole agents, where they cannot just engage in combat with an emperor without approval from above. Though it's not clear if that's the same exact condition for these guys, since they are Celestial Dragons after all, and perhaps they're just choosing not to make things more complicated than they need to be at this moment. We'll have to see how that goes, and just what exactly their job is supposed to be. And this brings us to some further exploration at a potential connection between Brook and Gunko. Up until the last chapter, all we had known was Gunko was a fan of New World, and presumably a fan of Soul King Brook as well, but then we got this decently sized bombshell that Brook was familiar with the Holy Knights in some capacity. It's not exactly clear just how much the general public is aware of the Holy Knights as a military force, as it could be a similar situation to the 5 Elders, where their existence is not necessarily hidden, but the average person on an island disconnected from most of the world will not be expected to be aware of all the political organizations and structures of the world in which they live. However, based on the reactions of more politically savvy and well-informed members of the crew, such as Jinbei and Robin, it feels to me that the Holy Knights may be much closer to being on a need-to-know basis, sort of like CP9, a branch of Cypherpole that has special privileges and is kept secret from the general public, but is very familiar to the Marines and other world government employees. So while Saul's awareness of the group is not really eyebrow-raising, Brook's knowledge is. Now, given Brook's age, we would expect him to have some pieces of information that the current generation is not privy to. I'm actually hoping for a lot of Rocks Pirate related stuff with that. And we've seen Brook regard Roger as a rookie during his time, and he's even shown knowledge of global powers such as Germa when others had not. But Brook knowing about the Holy Knights may have something to do with his time as the leader of a battle convoy in his kingdom, a place in the West Blue that we have not yet been made aware of. It's not very common for members of governments to resort to piracy, and when it does happen, it's for fairly extreme reasons. I mean, just take a look at what we saw with Kuma's backstory in the prior arc. With Brook being extremely loyal, as we see in this chapter, and honorable when it comes to oaths and promises, I would not expect him to just leave his kingdom unless he was forced to. There could be a lot of explanations for this, but I wonder if Brook's homeland was subject to one of these native hunting competitions or involved in some other conflict that the Holy Knights were present at. And in the aftermath, perhaps his kingdom was no more, forcing him to take to sea. But this chapter introduces another very curious angle, with Brook seemingly recognizing Gunko for a brief moment, or at least commenting on her. He does not really make mention of it again, but this at least insinuates that there is some deeper connection between Gunko and Brook that he may not necessarily register just yet, while Gunko has. You may have noticed that throughout the last few chapters, Gunko has taken extra care to obscure her right eye from the Straw Hats. When she first arrives on Colin's Spar, we see her hand in front of it in a rather cool pose, and immediately after she pulls down the brim of her hat over the same eye. And even when regenerating from Usopp's attack, the very last part to reform is that same right eye. She continues to hide her full face from the Straw Hats until they are rounded up in this chapter and her back is turned to them. But when Brook starts to recognize her, she turns back around and forms a sword with her bandages and forces Brook's head back, preventing him from getting a good look at her face. It's here that she declares that Brook will be her musician as a slave for the rest of his life, and a Celestial Dragon being interested in Brook's music comes as a shock to the Straw Hats, but Brook stands firm and pledges his allegiance solely to Luffy, at which point Gunko has obscured her eye once again with her hair and brim. And interestingly, when she kicks him away, she clutches at her heart in discomfort, unsure if this is an emotional response or perhaps even some sort of side effect of her regenerative abilities taking their toll. Anyway, for whatever reason, Gunko simultaneously wants to take Brook with her without revealing her true identity identity to him, an identity that has continued to be a mystery ever since her introduction, when she was the only Holy Knight to not get a Celestial Dragon or World Noble status, a saint title, or even a family name. I speculated that her name Gunko may have just been assigned to her at some point, perhaps after being orphaned or taken in by the Holy Knights, as her name is just the kanji for army and child. With the previously discussed notion that Brook may have left his kingdom's armed forces due to its defeat at the hands of Holy Knights, I'm beginning to wonder if Gunko was connected through that kingdom. Perhaps she was a child that survived the aftermath of that genocide, or perhaps she was simply taken by Celestial Dragons, as we've seen them do throughout the series. Could it be that she was raised to become a warrior for a world noble family that could not bear children of their own? There are a lot of ways this could go, and the possibilities could get pretty crazy considering that immortality and age preservation are things that are on the table. Gunko wanting to hide her other eye, which recall is a different color, could mean that eye is the giveaway that would make Brook fully recognize who she is. She could even be a loved one of Brook from his past, perhaps a partner, a child, a family member, who knows. One last potential connection I figure I should bring up is the specific choice of sword and technique that Gunko uses to threaten Brook here. Her arrows form a blade that is quite reminiscent of the fencing weapon known as a saber, and the raider squad that Brook was part of seemed to have been known for employing this sort of fighting style. So there's some potential there for Gunko to have been a member of that team in the past as well. So many possibilities at play here. I'd love to know where your head is at with these connections down in the comments. Now, in the previous chapter, Killingham had made his way back to the Walrus School after defeating Principal Tusk with brute strength and immobilizing or slumberizing Ainge with a technique based on sleep paralysis. Here, he took control of the transponder Pillbug in order to broadcast their threat across Elbaph, which we see Summers do in this chapter. Also of note, the mini transponder snails the Holy Knights use bear their insignia on their shells, looking to be the same one that we saw on Killingham's armband upon his introduction. Earlier in the arc, we learned about the Haugen village that no longer exists, but now we finally get a look at the rest of Elbaph outside the western village, including the craftsman village in the southwest and the huntsman village in the northeast. It seems these folks are a bit more specialized in their abilities, with the craftsmen using hammers and mallets, and some of them wearing these helmets adorned with antlers, while the huntsmen use bows and arrows and wear animal pelts, though we've seen giants with all of these features in the western village as well, and among the giant warrior pirates. We get a ton of different monsters in this chapter, with a few pumpkin-headed creatures, the giant lizard, more Draugr, a bulldog spider creature, what appears to be a sphinx, some sort of moose creature, a kraken or octopus, another dog, and perhaps the most frightening of all, the mothers, as even the giant warrior pirates find themselves helpless before them. The idea of these burly century-old giants still being afraid of their mothers is a gag right up Oda's alley, and in fact, Oda's even mentioned how the strongest being in the world is a mother in a prior SPS, so all of this totally tracks. I also love how these mothers are so fearsome that even the other sleeptids in the area are terrified by their presence. It's also really difficult to see this panel and not think of Big Mom. I know some of us in the fandom have been holding strong for hopes of seeing her return, and in fairness, there have naturally been a lot of nods to her character given her significance in the history of Elbaph between killing Jarul and Loki and Lola's potential marriage. Now, while one of these women were said to be in the likeness of Bent's mother, you have to admit the raging flaming hair is quite evocative of Big Mom's abilities. Plus, the other mother on the ship also seems to have some sort of flame around the back of her head, almost like a Lunarian or what we've seen with the other Draugrs, but she also has sparks of electricity running across her arms. It would be something if the real Big Mom somehow made a return amidst all of these lookalikes. Also, while we've seen all the children before and have known roughly half their names, we get a formal who's who of them in this chapter, and even learn some interesting details, like Johanna, the girl with dark horns not having parents, or Olav being Oimo's grandson. Now, Oimo is 153 years old in the present day, and he was sailing with the giant warrior pirates over 100 years ago until the crew temporarily disbanded while Dory and Brokey fought on Little Garden. He had returned to Elbaph until 50 years ago when he went to look for his captains alongside Kashi, so it's likely that this was the period in which he had a child, who would then go on to have their own child, Olav, in the last decade or two. Now, between Bent, Olav, Ylva, and Colin, there are at least 4 children here who are related to the giant warrior pirates and Gaban, giving them a vested personal interest in the safety of these kids. Summers had raved about the pain that the children's loved ones would feel in the prior chapters, and the Holy Knights are exploiting that to the fullest here. Killingham also mentions his desire to broadcast visuals of this game, which harkens back to what we saw in God Valley with the transponder snails relaying back the image of the hunt to Mary Joie. Summers announces their intentions to use the children as leverage, so the giants comply with their demands to be used as battle slaves. Recall that their original plan was to recruit Loki to their side so they could take Elbaph and the giants under their control by force. This all ties into what Gunko mentioned in the previous chapter about whatever side the Giants take being the ones to win the vast global war, and this further contextualizes everything we've known over the years about the world government's attempts at obtaining the might of giants, whether it be through gigantification research or diplomacy. And all of this tracks with Big Mom's belief that she would be able to become king of the pirates if she had the giants on her side. This also makes you wonder about Shanks' business on Elbaph, which is still somewhat of a mystery at this point. Could it be that after declaring his intention to claim the One Piece, he immediately went back to Elbaph to gain the help of the giants in this task? After all, they may feel indebted to him after he defeated Loki 6 years prior. Now Summers calls out Jarl by name and places the decision in his hands, since he seems to be the highest authority on the island at the moment, at least with Harald being dead and no other elders being introduced just yet. He demands that the giants pledge allegiance to the world government and destroy their school and library as a sign of fealty. In the previous chapter, Summers had shown his disgust at these institutions being on Elbaph, seeing them as useless for a land of warriors. He had also disclosed that the late King Harald was going to lend their might to the world government as mercenaries, something fairly similar to what we saw with Harald and the new Giant Warrior Pirates when they worked for Buggy's Delivery as mercenaries themselves. But for whatever reason, this plan did not come to fruition. Now, ever since we first learned of Harald and his campaign to make Elbaph a more gentle and open nation, I cannot help but think of how these were the same ideals that Mother Carmel had been pushing 63 years prior, and as such, I had been expecting this pacification of Elbaph was all in service of making it easier for the world government to conquer the nation in the future. While this could still be possible, I'm now wondering if Harald had done so in an attempt to make the nation less of a tool for the world government's conflicts. The Holy Knights had not been aware of the library or the school until they arrived, so it seems these things were set up behind their backs. The decision being in Jarl's hands specifically is also quite interesting, as I believe he could really go either way. On one hand, he would not want his nation to fall under the world government, but at the same time, his descendant is in grave danger, and plus, he historically had not been a fan of the ideals espoused by Carmel and Harald. These incentives together could be enough for him to decide the best course of action for Elbaph's safety is to actually work with the government. Plus, there's also a ton of speculation surrounding Jarl's true motivations. I've spoken at length in the previous breakdowns about how he may have been responsible for Harald's demise himself, citing the similarity of the sword in his head to the sword in Harald's portrait. And under the idea that Harald was weakening Elbaph despite the government, could it be that Jarl was actually the one sympathetic to their plans? There are quite a few ways this could go, and I've really been enjoying the mystery of who's the actual quote-unquote traitor of the nation. And begs the Holy Knights to spare the library, as it holds knowledge that benefits the world at large with the collection from Ohara. This may seem like something you should probably keep secret from the government, but since they are already set on destroying the library, I don't think it changes their opinion that much. Ultimately, this is more of a setup for motivating Robin, who refuses to let such a thing happen again. And I love that we're getting to see her leap into action here, and her being portrayed besides Gabon is rather incredible. It also makes me wonder if there's some sort of secret connection between the two. Robin's father was said to have died when Robin was rather young, so I doubt it's something like that, but could Gabon have known Olvia at some point? Whatever the case, I'm looking forward to seeing both of them go all out. Initially, I envisioned Robin taking on Summers with the whole flower and thorn motif being interesting, but it seems Summers may be headed elsewhere, perhaps toward the children, so Gabon may be intercepting him there. This could leave Gunko for Robin, or even killing him who's at the library. I'd love to know what you think these matchups may be down in the comments. As always, you can find all of my weekly manga breakdowns in the playlist in the description, and if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.